And I'll email this out to you guys, but this is kind of your study guide for the final exam. Go over things related to each of the final exam questions, so you're fully confident that you understand all the critical content that we covered. Really can't stick it out for this class. So I mentioned last time we were talking about stakeholders that's something important for final exam, and sure enough, it's right there in the beginning. And this idea that when we're designing interventions and when we're testing interventions, it's very important that you involve all of the stakeholders that might be affected by the program, and you design it so that the intervention or the knowledge is useful to the stakeholders. But the final exam, of course, we try to trick you to make it harder. And remember that stakeholders are people that have a direct impact from the intervention itself, right? The people that are doing evaluations of the program, they're not really directly affected by it, right? So the researchers that are designing the designing the test, whether it works or not, they are not stakeholders. Okay, so researchers are not stakeholders. Only the people that are directly impacted by a program are stakeholders. Then the next issue that the final exam gets at is this idea of different forms of collecting data in person versus not in person. And when we're doing things in person, it's an interview, right? And you can have an interview guide and such. So anything in person is an interview. If it's not done in person, but you're doing a survey through the internet or on paper, one-to-many as a group, then that is not in person. Okay, so any survey or questionnaire or something that people can fill out on their own, that is not in person. That's separate from interviews. Just need to jump across here. So remember, stakeholder people directly impacted, and the questionnaire is something that can be done independently of the researcher. You can do it anytime, any place, using any kind of asynchronous mode, which can be on paper, on the computer, but usually not at the same time. If it's done over the phone, then it's not necessarily a questionnaire. Next, the next topic is about the difference between qualitative and quantitative research. And this idea that I want you to know qualitative research has been around longer, listening to people's words, interpreting what words are being said, and it existed long before statistics and fancy math that we use today. In fact, a lot of what we're doing in quantitative research with the numbers and such is just taking advantage of the power the computers have offered us. So remember, qualitative has its roots in anthropology, sociology, psychology, linguistics. It's been around since the 1800s. So qualitative research is sort of the original way we understood the world, and our rapid shift in the last few decades to quantitative is only because that's what computers want. Computers make it easier for us. The next question about quantitative research is another tricky one. And remember, quantitative research, when we're doing things with numbers, it allows us to test hypothesis, right? We can test any hypothesis if we can quantify it. because then we can prove it with mathematics. If we want to learn more about people without testing hypothesis, then it's going to be qualitative. So quantitative is only for testing our hypothesis of what we know to be true already or think to be true, and qualitative is for exploring new ideas. Covered the first 4. Next, we're on to the 5th one here. And this is about the quasi-experimental design. And let me bring up what that quasi-experimental design means, because it's a very interesting concept. So when we think of the experiments, we often are imagining things to be the true experiment. And with the true experiment, we have to have the random assignment and an intervention and a post-test. So anytime we don't have random assignment, it suddenly becomes quasi-experimental. Quasi-experimental is this one. So quasi-experimental, no random assignment. There's different forms of quasi-experimental design. It can be a comparison group, or it can be any way in which we just didn't randomly assign people to the intervention. Other forms of quasi-experiment, like natural experiments, where states enact different policies, and we just see how the states are different, or we purposely match people that are similar, or we just assume that people in 2 different classes are the same. So quasi means sort of. And so anything that's quasi-experimental is like an experiment, but doesn't have the random assignment. So is quasi-experimental the best way to test things? That's what the test is asking you. And it's not the best. So just know that quasi is not the absolute best way. The best way is the true experiment. Okay? And what medical interventions use is variations of the true experiment approach, randomized control trials, they call it, and just large-scale true experiments. But you can still test things using the quasi-experimental method, particularly when there's ethical reasons for not doing random assignments, or practical reasons where it's not possible, but it's not the best. Okay? That's the idea of quasi-experimental. So it's not the preferred method. It's the study guide here, because it's not the preferred. True experiment is preferred. Okay, and then it asked you about single subject designs, single system designs, and that was that ABA kind of testing that we had showed you before. I think this final exam really digs relatively deeply on this single subject design, which I found interesting that we saved it until the very last content before but yet we make it a big part of the final exam. And so let me put the single subject design thing on the board again. The idea of your testing interventions through continuous monitoring of someone. And as long as you can quantify what you're looking at, very powerful way to test things. So does this look like it's quantitative or qualitative? Are we interpreting the information through numbers in some way or through words that people said? Obviously numbers, right? So this is quantitative, yes. So single subject is quantitative, okay? Remember that. It has to be in terms of numbers. Is there a way you could do a qualitative version of single subject design? What do you think? You couldn't make the graph like this, but theoretically, you might do this all the time when you're testing out different things with like, say you're training your pet to walk better on a leash. You might not cognitively count how many times the dog's not cooperating, but you can just tell, oh, he behaves better when we're doing the same loop in the neighborhood versus going to a new place, right? So you can do single system things qualitatively, theoretically, but for the purposes of the final exam, single subject research are quantitative, they are not qualitative. Okay. And the designers of this class really like to hound in on this nominal ordinal interval ratio concept. And that was something early on in the class. And let me just see if I can find that under conceptualization. And that is, all right, well, so you'll remember that nominal is just words or categories that you could put people in. The most common one is gender or race, religion. Here it gives us sleep versus awake, though in my eyes that could be considered ordinal too. But typically it's some sort of category for which there is no ranking. Okay? And as we get more specific, like there's some ranking but it's not consistent, that's ordinal. And as it gets more and more consistent, it becomes interval as long as there's not a true zero. There's no way to get a zero on the IQ test. It's designed to give you some baseline number. Otherwise, theoretically, there could be a way. But ratio has to be a true zero. So variations of that issue are on the final exam where you need to apply those understandings of nominal, ordinal, interval, and ratio. And so when we're talking about nominal, this is where we're measuring kind, but not quantity. So if we're interested in what something is, but not necessarily any quantity. And then sampling methods. This is something that's going to be big for your paper, where I'd like to think about how you're going to find your sample, and it's okay, it's a convenience sample most of the time, because a lot of what you guys are talking about in your research question is exploratory, and convenience sample, snowball sampling is fine for exploring ideas, but if you have an existing hypothesis that you want to test, then you need to do a more inclusive sample, and you'll remember that the list that everyone is included on, that could be included in a random sample, is the sampling frame. So in order to do randomization, you have to have a sampling frame to start from, which is basically a list of everyone, or something that everyone has, or you assume everyone has, like a phone number, an address, something like that, that one assumes everyone has that you could use to find them. Okay? Remember, sampling frame is that list of everyone. And then here's talking about the next question about ABA design. It's again the single subject design that we talked about earlier. And you'll remember that A indicates the baseline. So A is always baseline, and B is the intervention. And as long as you remember A is baseline and B is intervention, you are good to go. The test is going to try and fool you into choosing something else. A is baseline, B is intervention. Okay. Then the next it asks about what is action research. In fact, it's literally a question that asks what is action research. And I would love for it to be an open-ended question and see what you guys said, but It's not. It's multiple choice. And remember, action research is intended to create social change. That's what makes action research unique. You're literally part of the social change movement, fighting for the rights of some group. Next, it gets into the idea of evaluation and the different forms of evaluation. And you remember we have the program evaluation and process evaluation and outcome evaluation is 3 different ways that you could explore evaluation. And the test uses a slightly different word that if you later you'd be familiar with, you might not be so familiar with. It uses the word formative evaluation. You guys ever heard of the idea of a formative assessment? A formative assessment is something that doesn't count for your grade. So if it's not graded, you just do it just to see where you're at. Then you later use a summative assessment as your grade. So first draft of the paper is a formative assessment, and the final paper is a summative assessment, right? So a formative evaluation is sort of a look at how the process is working, right? So if you hear about formative evaluation, that's basically a process evaluation. And in that, the process evaluation, remember, that's all about describing the program in detail and monitoring the program and providing some quality assurance for the program. Okay, so we're thinking about the purposes and of doing a formative evaluation. That is describing the program, monitoring the program, and providing some quality assurance that the program is actually working as intended. Right. Next, we're at number 12. We're halfway through the test. And this one is, again, about assessment and getting at the idea of what are the differences between a needs assessment. Anyone describe what a needs assessment is? Are you familiar? So a needs assessment is like a survey of what are the problems an area faces and what are the service providers there. So if we're doing a needs assessment for a homeless population or something like that in Arlington, we would look around, see how many homeless people we can find, see what kind of service providers that are available to them, and that would give us a sense of whether there's unmet need or not, right? Anytime you open a business, you can do a needs assessment. Is there a need for another hamburger restaurant? Is there a need for another ice cream shop? Right? Same idea. They look at the demographics of the population, look at what kind of services are already available, and then based on that, they decide that there is or is not a need for a new place. Okay. Process assessment we just talked about. That's the program description, program monitoring, and quality assurance. Outcome assessment is when you only care about are you changing people's life in the way that you expected. So say you have you're paying a tutor to help you with your class. You only care that the tutor gets you the A in the class, right? If you're taking a medicine, you only care that the medicine makes you feel better. So outcome assessment, we care only about the outcome. And a lot of times when we take medication, we don't fully understand the mechanism of how it works, why it works. But as long as it works, the outcome is good, right? That's the idea of an outcome assessment. An efficiency analysis is just whether the cost and the benefits make sense. You know, if it costs, if you take like the VIA shared ride service, I think it costs $5 just about anywhere you want to go. If you're going a long distance, that's a good deal. If you're just going across the street, it's not such a good deal, right? So we all do efficiency analysis in our own mind, and government does it all the time when they want to decide whether or not they're going to pay for an intervention or not. Somehow not able to see my mouse. There we go. White background. Okay. Now we're on to number 13, more than halfway through. And we're talking about focus groups and what focus groups are good for. And focus groups are a common approach. Many of you, for your final paper, you can use that as one of your methods that you would use to answer your question. And we can use focus groups to develop hypotheses. And we can use focus groups to assess a range of options about an issue, see how people respond to the various ideas about that issue. You could investigate the meaning of survey results or needs assessment surveys. You could use focus groups for just about anything. But the question is one of these, which one is it not, right? Focus groups not good if you want to generalize the findings, because you can only generalize if you have a random sample, and theoretically a relatively large random sample. But focus groups by nature are usually not a random sample. It's a convenience sample of people that are willing to participate, usually spend an hour with you talking about it. So focus groups are not good for generalizing findings. Okay? If you want to generalize findings, you do a survey, large survey. Anything that's not a large survey is not likely to be generalizable. Some large experiments may be generalizable if they're large enough and you got random enough. Okay. The next question about 14, question 14, is about qualitative methods and how they are used. And remember, we can use qualitative methods to explore ideas. Anything that's exploratory, going off in a new direction where we don't know much, that's perfect for qualitative, right? Yeah, remember, exploratory for qualitative. The next is about the logic model and the different components for that. And here for a moment. We use these kind of things all the time, and when you are working in the field, you're very likely to encounter these. So remember, inputs and outputs are what we are concerned about in the logic model, okay? So inputs are the resources needed for the program to operate, while the outputs are tangible results of the program process. And you have to be able to kind of brainstorm and label what specific inputs and outputs might be, because these are all things that you can measure to do any kind of process analysis, process evaluation. So if things work, you can show why they work, and if they don't work, you can figure out at what stage things aren't working, because there's some mismatch between your inputs and your outputs. And yeah, and number 16 is getting at again the difference between the population, sampling frame, sample, and elements. Hopefully, these concepts are clear to you. Population is everyone. Sampling frame is the list of everyone eligible that you can reach theoretically. Sample are the people that are willing to participate and actually give you responses. An element is any individual person in your study. The next idea is about the different forms of review for the IRB and whether we use exempt, expedited, or full board review. So exempt is something for which you don't know the identity and there's no risk to the participant. Expedited means there's no more than minimal risk of any kind. And full IRB review is for any time there's more than minimal risk. And anytime you're looking at a vulnerable population, like children, people are institutionalized in prisons or hospitals or nursing homes, you always have to do a full board review because we are concerned whether or not they are truly consenting to the study. So just remember those differences, whether something is exempt, no risk, expedited, minimal risk, but no vulnerable population. And if any vulnerable population is included, then it's a full IRB review. It's going to take weeks for the 5 people to review it and offer their feedback about ethics and such. Oops. Right. Okay. The next question about the literature review. And such, so in our last chapter of the book, it talks about the different steps of the proposal and the purpose of each section. And so I need to remember that introductory statement is just there to put the context to the issue, make it sound like it's an important issue that either has a great impact on certain individuals or affects a very large number of individuals or all of society on some level. The literature review part describes how the research question and plan builds on what has already been reported on the topic. So it shows that you're standing on the shoulder of giants and building on what's already known, so you're not reinventing the wheel, but in fact on a good path that we've never gone on before, but related to that. The methodological plan, where you describe what methods you're going to use for sampling, data collection, and data analysis. Statement of limitations is where you just brainstorm about how the study might have been better if you could have done things differently. If you're familiar with those ideas, then you'll be fine with that question. Statement of limitations is how you would improve the study, thinking about what problems in interpretation you might have. But basically, what's wrong with the study, how it's not perfect. The next one, number 19, is again focused on the different forms of evaluation and the difference between the needs assessment, the process evaluation, and outcome evaluation, and efficiency evaluation. So they just give you an example, and I think it's obvious as can be from their example what the right answer is. So just be familiar with those different forms of evaluation. The next one is a fascinating idea, looking at should put dark mode on. Perfect. Okay. So this next one, they give us a scenario, a very unique scenario, and they ask us what method to use to collect the data. And so we'll show you the different response options here on the screen, and you'll have to understand what they mean. So intensive interviewing means interviewing people one by one, right? So if you'd use intensive interviewing when everyone would have a different experience with that situation, and you want to probe in depth about their unique experience, right? If it's a topic for which people largely fall into groups or categories, so say whether you're a dog person or a cat person, that doesn't require an intensive interview. you could just explore that with a focus group, right? So if there's a subject where people fall into different kind of categories, it makes more sense to explore that in a focus group. If it's a subject for which it requires some cultural understanding to understand all the nuance of how people believe something, you might immerse yourself in the culture and do some kind of action research approach, right? You can use an unobtrusive method if you can answer the question by just observing people without, by just observing a crowd or something like that. You could explore Black Friday sales and how people react during that just using unobtrusive methods. So the approach you take depends on the situation, but you'd only use intensive interviewing if everyone has a different experience. You'd use focus groups if people fall into broad categories and you just want to explore those broad categories. And you would use immersion or something like that if it's something that you can easily observe in a large group. All right. The 22nd question is about grounded theory. And with grounded theory, the idea is we don't know what to think from the start. We just collect a lot of observations, and based on our observations, we induce a theory. Okay, so grounded theory is inducing theory from observations. That's all it's for. Next, we're on to number 23. And this is about, oh, I see. Yeah. Okay. Well, this is supposed to have on the screen here. What inductive reasoning leads to? So remember the difference between inductive and deductive? Inductive means you observe first, then make your decision later. Deductive means you have belief first, and you test it later. Okay? So that's what we're talking about there. So know what inductive reasoning leads to. Inductive reasoning leads to understanding of the issue using kind of a grounded theory approach, right? That grounded theory is the best example of inductive reasoning. Okay. Know the purpose of each form of an assessment tool. Looking at the different assessment tools we had, like cost-benefit analysis, cost-effectiveness analysis, process analysis, needs assessment. If you're familiar with each of those, you'll be good on the 24th question. And then the 25th question is looking at when you would use a specific form of evaluation. Okay, so the last questions are just different scenarios applying these different evaluation techniques and such. So if you're familiar with those different evaluation techniques, that is like 5 questions on the test. So that's it. That is your entire final exam in a nutshell. I will make it available, and you can do it at your will. I took off the requirement to use the Respondus browser. That always causes problems. But you might as well check off this requirement how you can. I made the final research proposal thing available in Canvas as well. So if you click on that, it should have some kind of a rubric there. So look over this more detailed rubric about the final paper and use it as kind of a guidance. You can recycle everything from your proposal paper. That's fine. The only thing that we ask you to do is to try and apply as much of the class vocabulary as you can when you're thinking about the methodology and what method you're going to use. It doesn't have to be so long. If it's at around 7 pages is fine. For me, I think that's enough. If you go a little bit beyond that, that's okay. If you go way beyond it, okay, I'll read it, but it's 7 to 10 pages at most is usually more than enough to do that. So feel free, you can email me a draft, and it's really just thinking about how you would use a sampling, what kind of ethical considerations you might take into account, which of the various data collection methods we use would make sense and apply to your concept, and then what are the limitations inherent in your study. Usually it's related to sampling. You only have access to a limited number of people. It's hard to get a random sample and things like that. Okay, that's it. You do those two things, the final exam, which I made available, and the final paper, and you are done. So I will be here next week, but we're out of content in a sense. So if you want to be here, I can work with you on your final paper. But as of today, we're kind of done. We've covered everything that we need to cover. If you guys have any questions about any content, feel free to ask. I'll continue to show up here, and I can always tell stories and such, show you videos, plenty of things. But with this, you have been armed with all the knowledge, and I oversee parts of the PhD program here and the management of it, and I know what they teach in the classes. And what they teach in the classes is the same things we talked about here. That's basically it. Each week, content is an entire course for them. They go into much more depth, but you guys are now ready to do real research, because it's the same way that we train our future professors and our doctoral students. It's just this exact same content. We just go into more depth and more examples and force them to do it in the real world. And those real world experiences, they'll tell you a lot about how the theory differs from the reality, and we try to make it sound simple in textbooks, and in textbooks it's all logical and makes sense, and in the real world it's a mess. Yesterday I was in a data collection at a senior center. We were doing a survey with these older people, and it was obvious they didn't understand the questions on the survey. It was obvious it was an experiment actually where they had to participate in an intervention, and we did a pre-test, intervention, and post-test. This was the post-test. And a lot of people were doing the post-test on didn't show up to any of the intervention things. They just, it was voluntary for them to show up, and they just didn't. So it's so messy, and it makes so much sense that you test intervention on people, and then you can see whether it works. Or people don't cooperate, or they don't understand the intervention on the same level that you did when you designed it. And so I think we'll have a lot of changes in our understanding over time. All the examples we give in the textbooks are generally studies like in the 1960s and 1970s. It always shocks me. It's like, oh, the Stanford prison experiment is the only thing we can talk about, right? It's one of the best examples, but it's 50 years ago content. New stuff is happening all the time. But we're still just as ill-informed on how the mind works and how people's behavior are as we were 50 years ago. Because the more we understand, or more data we collect, the more we realize people are just more complicated than we ever imagined, and more different than we ever imagined as well. I don't know if we'll ever come up to some grand understanding of all human understanding, because we're all unique on some level. But I hope you've gained some good insight into how we know what is true, but also a little bit of suspicion in that anything that sounds simple and easy and clear may not be as simple in the real world. And ideally we'll have good intervention for people with addiction, but nothing is perfect. Ideally we'll have good programs for homeless, for ADHD, for children victims of sexual abuse, and any issue you think about, migrants, people that are facing all kinds of challenges. You guys are putting yourself in a position to totally transform people's lives. When you're out there in the field and you're doing the social work, you will be changing the world. And if you're able to discover something new and you publish it, you share it with the world, you'll truly have a massive impact on the world and perhaps change the direction. So each of you guys is in a good position to transform the world. Hopefully with this class you've got, probably nothing was totally branding to you, but by the fact that you're trying to apply this to an idea that's related to your topic, it gets you in the mindset that you can change the field at any point in your life. It's never too late. Thank you all. Anyone have any questions, comments?